Hey guys, it's Medicosis Perfectionalis one more time, continuing our playlist called Pulmonology. In the previous two videos, we talked about ventilation and perfusion. Today I'll talk about ventilation-perfusion mismatch, or VQ mismatch. V for ventilation and Q for perfusion. And what's gonna happen if you have defective ventilation, and what's gonna happen if you have a defective perfusion. Some words of wisdom. Your shoes and bags don't need to match always. It's perfect to be mismatched too. Okay. Unlike this Bollywood culture, in medicine, mismatch can be a serious problem. I'm talking about the VQ mismatch, by the way. It can be normal, like the mismatch between your lung apex and your lung base, but it can also be a catastrophe, such as a severe emphysema or even a pulmonary artery embolism, which is fatal. So, when it comes to medicine, you better talk to your pulmonologist, an actual expert, not some celebrity on TV, for heaven's sake. By the way, I have some premium videos that are not available on my YouTube channel. Just go to patreon.com/medicosis, click on video premium on the left side, and then you'll be able to access them. As you know, pulmonary ventilation means we are ventilating the alveoli and the dead space, but alveolar ventilation means just the alveoli. Ventilation-perfusion ratio depends on two things. First, the ventilation, which depends on the alveolar pressure, and perfusion, which depends on the cardiac output. We're talking about the alveolar pressure here, not the pulmonary pressure, because no one cares if you're just ventilating your dead space. Okay, by the way, what is the purpose of the dead space? Why not just have alveoli in our nose so that gas exchange can happen here instead of just wasting some space called dead space? I'll tell you why. Because if you live in a very cold weather, these alveoli are gonna clot and coagulate in cold weather. That's why they are way down here in your lungs. And your nose and all of this stuff is just conducting zone to make the air warmer and to get some debris out, etc., etc., etc. Okay, VQ ratio. What is the normal value? 0.8 or 80%. This is the normal. Ideally, it should have been 100%. But as you know, we're talking about the Earth. Nothing is 100%. So you and me are 80%, and that's okay. Now let's see what's going to happen at the apex. So here is the VQ ratio. At the apex there is less gravity than here. And as you know from physics, there is the escape velocity for air, which means air tends to escape, but it's bound by the gravity. But if you compare air with fluid such as blood, air tends to float and try to escape more than liquid, which is common sense. So at the apex of your lung, you have decreased ventilation. But the decrease in perfusion is even higher thanks to gravity or lack of gravity relative to the base. When you have decreased ventilation but severe decrease in perfusion, the ratio, the VQ ratio, is going up. So the apex has an increased VQ ratio. Instead of just 0.8, the apex is actually 3. Now let's talk about the base. The base has many blood. The pulmonary artery is coming and everything is here. So by gravity will pull both air and blood, but it's gonna pull blood more. So you have increased perfusion, but only a slight increase in ventilation. What's gonna happen to the VQ ratio? And the answer is it's going down. So in the base, it's 0.6 instead of 0.8. Okay, the way I remember it, the VQ ratio, high is high and low is low. Apex is high, therefore the VQ ratio is high, and base is low, therefore the VQ ratio is low. VQ ratio, here's normal, here's a ventilation defect, and here's a perfusion defect. Normally, again, 80%. Ideally, theoretically, it should be 100%. Ventilation defect. You're having problem getting the air into your alveoli, into your respiratory zone. So what's going to happen to the ventilation? It's going to decrease. What's going to happen to the ratio? It's going to decrease. Less than 80%. If it's severe, it can even reach 0. Let's talk about perfusion defect. Now there is a problem with the pulmonary artery. Let's say a pulmonary embolism or a fat embolism. What's going to happen to the perfusion? It's going to decrease. What's going to happen to the ratio? It's going to increase more than 80%. If it increases too much, or if there is like a block to this area of the lung, and now we have an infarction, it's infinity at this location. Here is normal, here is the normal base, here is the normal apex. Normally, overall, the VQ ratio of your lung is 80%. Again, in the base, low is low, the ratio is low. In the apex, high is high, the ratio is high. Some clinical pearls. Let's get to the crux of the matter, not to be confused with the crux of the diaphragm. There is more diffusion in the base relative to the apex. Amen, thanks to gravity. That's why infarction usually happens in the lower lobe of the lung. Are you starting to understand? Here's the lung. Here's the blood. There is more perfusion in the base. Lack of perfusion is gonna affect the base more. If I get my allowance from daddy and my brother is independent, he works on his own, then if my daddy's salary is affected, who's gonna be affected? Me, because I'm more dependent on daddy's salary. Same freaking thing. The base is more dependent on the perfusion. When you take the perfusion away, the base is gonna suffer the most. So the infarction is common in the lower lobe. Now, to be anatomically accurate, the lower lobe is even lower than that because, again, there is still the back of the lung. Okay, this is anatomically sophisticated. Next, infarction in a normal lung is very unlikely. Why? Because the lung has dual blood supply. What do you mean? I mean the pulmonary system and the bronchial system. You have bronchial arteries and pulmonary arteries. Okay, so if you have a patient and the patient had lung disease before the infarction, then the lung is going to be affected. But if I'm a normal guy, let's say that I'm normal, and then if a clot happened in my pulmonary artery, if it's a very small clot, you know what's going to happen? Nothing. Why? Because I still have bronchial arteries. I still have dual blood supply. If you compromise one for a little bit, it's not going to happen. And thanks to TPA, it's going to destroy the clot and restore the function. But if I have been smoking my lungs out for 30 years, my lungs are history. You just block one blood supply and it's over. That's how infarction happens. What kind of infarction in the lung? Red or pale? And the answer is red, aka hemorrhagic and not pale. Why hemorrhagic? Because the lung is a tissue with loose texture. This is gonna allow the red blood cells to be released from the damaged vessel and diffuse through the necrotic tissue. Therefore, your tissue is gonna have a red or hemorrhagic morphology. TB reactivation, also known as secondary TB, when you are immunocompromised. Why does it happen in the apex of the lung? Some people would say because there is more ventilation in the apex. Wrong, there is more ventilation in the base. So why does TB gets reactivated in the apex? Because there is more ventilation to perfusion ratio. Not just there is more ventilation, no, there is more ventilation in the base and there is more perfusion in the base. The apex has more ventilation to perfusion ratio. Big difference and a famous mistake by students. Why does TB care about ventilation or ventilation to perfusion ratio? Because it's an aerobic bacteria. There is a second reason. There is less perfusion up there in the apex and therefore less white blood cells to fight the nasty bacillus. And that's why, my friend, you should always auscultate above the clavicle to hear the apex of the lung. Don't just go 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm done, show me your back, 1, 2, 3, 4, like an idiot. You should auscultate over the base, over the apex, which happens to be above the clavicle, if you want to catch secondary TB. And the guy who actually invented the stethoscope used it first to diagnose tuberculosis. That was his specialty. You know how did he die? From tuberculosis. I'm so sad because I made so many videos about leukemias and lymphomas. I just want to cry. What a horrible fate. In cases of obstructive lung disease, especially the severe obstructive such as severe emphysema, there is decreased ventilation. Remember, I've told you cigarette smoking will lead to chronic emphysema. Chronic emphysema will lead to hypoventilation, which is going to lead to two main things: decrease PO2 and increase PCO2. Together they lead to something called air hunger. And then give it some time, it's gonna end up in death, which is horrible. A third thing that's gonna happen is the VQ ratio decreases because you're decreasing ventilation, therefore you're decreasing the ratio. Next, pulmonary artery thrombus or embolus will decrease perfusion. So here's the VQ. When you decrease perfusion, you're increasing the VQ ratio. It's called fifth grade math. Here is a sophisticated philosophical question. Is it better to have a high VQ ratio or low VQ ratio? Both are bad, honey. Both are bad. It's better to have a normal VQ ratio, which happens to be equal 0.8. How do you use this clinically? I mean diagnostically. There is something called the VQ scan, designed specifically to catch pulmonary embolism. See, when you understand physiology, when you tie it with the clinical stuff, it's a piece of cake. Once you understand the basics first. Medicine makes so much sense if explained properly, and that's a very big if. Let's talk about response to hypoxia, and this is something that's really fascinating. Every single organ responds to hypoxia by vasodilation, except the lung. Hypoxia in the lung causes vasoconstriction. Okay, the exact mechanism is poorly understood, and if you think about it and try to contemplate for a long time, it's freaking amazing because you either constrict to hypoxia or you dilate. You don't just dilate at the kidney and constrict at the lung. It's just profound. Now, why is that? So here is your kidney, and there is hypoxia. The kidney is hungry for oxygen. Therefore, the renal artery is gonna dilate to supply more oxygen to the kidney. Makes sense. Let's talk about your lung. Let's say that there is a crazy alveolus here, and those crazy alveoli have decreased blood supply due to a problem to the branch of the artery that supplies them. Now you will have a problem here. Why didn't you vasodilate? Why did you vasoconstrict? I'll tell you. I'll vasoconstrict this vessel because it's hopeless. But let's give chance for other alveoli to have the rest of the blood. So that you don't die. You don't just put all of your money in one basket. You diversify to be financially sophisticated. Okay, fun. Response to hypocapnia. Hypocapnia means decreased PCO2, which will lead to alkalosis because CO2 is an acid. Why is CO2 an acid? Because it yields carbonic anhydrase if you just add water to the carbon dioxide and add an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which removes the water from the PCO2. It's kind of just like there are two people and we just want to separate them. How do you separate water from this PCO2? By making H2CO3. Because literally, anhydrase means to remove the water, and carbonic means carbon dioxide. So this is the enzyme that's going to remove water from the equation by forming a compound called carbonic acid. But this is water. No, this is not water. You remember chemistry? Sodium chloride is neither sodium nor chloride. It's a compound, and the compound does not share the properties of the elements, if you remember those science classes. Anyways, back to our story. Hypocapnia leads to respiratory alkalosis. This will trigger a reflex to vasoconstrict. Why? To keep the CO2 in your lung, in your system. Okay, this is gonna lead to acidosis, which will try to compensate the alkalosis. Freaking amazing. My body is just smarter than me. Way smarter than me. I'm so happy that I don't control my heart rate or my respiratory rate most of the time. I can override them, but those are brainstem functions. So here is the normal value. Here is decreased ventilation or a ventilation defect. Here is a perfusion defect. First, let's talk about VQ ratio. Normally 0.8. If you have a ventilation defect, the ratio is going to decrease. If you have a perfusion defect, the ratio is going to increase. Called common sense. Next, we have P big AO2, which means oxygen pressure in the alveolus. Normally 105. If you decrease ventilation, you decrease oxygen. It's called common sense. It's 40. So the oxygen pressure in the alveoli now equals the oxygen in the vein. Ooh, that's bad. And this is called shunting. The blood came to the lung empty, and the blood left the lung empty. This is called shunt-like physiology. The blood came devoid of oxygen and it left without oxygen. If you have a perfusion defect, it's going to be 152. Why? Alveolar air became similar to atmospheric air because there is no gas exchange. This is called dead space physiology. So ventilation defect is also known as shunt-like physiology. Perfusion defects also known as dead space physiology. Let's talk about P small AO2. Normally is 100. Next, let's talk about PVO2, which is the venous oxygen. Normally is 40. Hypoventilation, 40. Hypoperfusion, again 40. Let's talk about P big A CO2, which means the partial pressure of CO2 in the alveoli. So normally is 40. Alveolar air is like the arterial blood. I mean, it has lots of oxygen, but little CO2. In decreased ventilation, you are keeping the air in. You are air trapping. The PCO2 is going to increase. That's why with hypoventilation, you end up with respiratory acidosis. Makes perfect sense. In decreased perfusion, it's 0. Because the alveolar air became similar to the atmospheric air, and I've told you that the CO2 in the atmosphere is 0.04. Okay, for physics or for physicists, this is a big deal, but in medicine, it's negligible. PVCO2, which means CO2 in the venous blood, 46 is normal, here is 46, here is 46. So when I've told you that in decreased ventilation, alveolar air is like the venous blood, I didn't lie to you. And also when I've discussed that in perfusion defect, alveolar air becomes similar to the atmospheric air, I didn't lie to you. Okay, let's talk about the response. What is the response to hypoventilation? It's hypoxia. Hypoxia in the lung, and in the lung only, causes vasoconstriction. This will force the blood to the well-ventilated areas. When the bronchus is closed, close the vessel. That's a good motto in life, and it's used in the corporations. When there is a corporation and it's a conglomerate, which means it includes many small corporations, and there is a big umbrella. When one of them start to lose money for 10 years in a row, it's time to get rid of just this piece while preserve the whole structure. They call it a spin-off. So they spin this part off, and it's just now we are ending up with the profitable structures. Same freaking concept. But they don't teach the alveoli and the hypoxia in business school. What a shame. Let's talk about response to a perfusion defect. You have hypocapnia. I've told you the CO2 is 0, hypocapnia, leading to respiratory alkalosis. Gonna trigger a reflex, leading to vasoconstriction. To keep the CO2 in, causing acidosis to compensate the respiratory alkalosis. When the vessel is closed, close the bronchus. I'm super sophisticated today to the point of being stupid. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and join the tribe. Hit the bell to get notifications. Follow me on Facebook. I have 100 cases there. And on Patreon, you can get my premium videos. You can get my cases, my post notes, my PDF, my audio notes, and even my courses. I have one-on-one Skype calls if you're interested. If you want me to explain any medical topic to you. This is Medicosis Perfectionalis, where medicine makes perfect sense. Until next time, please be safe, stay happy, and study hard, and make sure to adequately ventilate and perfuse to keep your VQ ratio normal at 0.8.